Bo knows in Seattle, the Seahawks taking a close look at a familiar name for Pac-12 fans in one of their latest top 30 visits. We'll be breaking it all down on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in, whether you're in nearby Sumner, Washington, or from my old neck of the woods in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We are inside 3 weeks to go until the 2024 NFL draft. So we've only got a couple more mock draft Mondays left, Rob. We're going to be diving into Chad Ryder of NFL.com's latest 5-round mock, looking at all the picks and trades that he made for the Seahawks. And we're going to play a little bit of what is 3 teams that the Seahawks could select in the first round and what the ripple effects could be in the middle rounds for John Schneider and the front office. This episode is brought your way by our friends at GameTime. Create an account, download the GameTime app, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Now for your lead story here on our early Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. We've reached the time of year where it seems by day that we are learning more and more players that have had official top 30 visits with the Seattle Seahawks. And we're now approaching knowing 10 of those names. And maybe the biggest names that we have had to this point in the last few days have been reported and confirmed with multiple sources that I've had the chance to speak with. But let's start with the biggest name, at least from a position standpoint. Bo Nix, the Heisman finalist from Oregon. And Rob, I know that you are very high on Bo Nix coming out of Oregon, and it's understandable when you look at the numbers. 45 touchdown passes and just 3 interceptions last year for the Ducks. He also led the country with a 77.3% completion percentage, and he's an extremely athletic quarterback that can do damage with his legs. I'm not surprised at all that the Seahawks are taking another look at him, especially when they had some coaches that already were at Oregon's Pro Day, as you know very well, taking a close look at this kid.
Yeah, it's easy to understand because he plays the quarterback position, and obviously Seattle wants to kick the tires on every quarterback that they view as a starting caliber kind of a guy at the NFL. And the steady improvement that Bo Nix has shown from his days at Auburn, where even though he beat Alabama as a freshman, there was such expectation that he was going to be able to take Auburn back to a national championship kind of a stage. And when that didn't happen, he made the transfer to Oregon and resurrected his career. Anybody who is watching on YouTube, and thank you as always, can see the numbers there. As you mentioned, Corbin, 77.3% completion percentage is absolutely unbelievable. Then 45 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions through the air. I mean, it sounds like something out of a video game, especially when you consider how athletic that he is. Bo Nix has all of the traits that you're looking for, but he also is a little bit of a function of previously that Auburn offense and then Oregon as well. And I do have some reservations about how well that he would be able to translate his particular skill set into the style of offense that Ryan Grubb demonstrated or preferred, I should say, at the University of Washington, at least for the last couple of seasons. Again, that's one of the things that we have to remember with Ryan Grubb is that this is not somebody who is just focused on what he did with the Huskies. He has shown a lot more creativity and versatility than that. But still, I think that Bo Nix is a quarterback that the Seahawks are kind of doing their due diligence. I think that they recognize his intangibles, the starting potential that he has. But frankly, I would be stunned if Bo Nix winds up being a member of the Seattle Seahawks moving forward.
Yeah, you mentioned a few of the reasons that I'm not as high on Bo Nix as what some draft analysts are out there. I look at Oregon's offense, and there were so many RPOs, so many quick strike passes, and some of this belongs to credit for him. He does have a really quick release. He gets the ball out fast. He was third in the country last year in lowest time per throw in the pocket, and that was not because he had a bad offensive line. It's the opposite. Oregon's got a fantastic offensive line led by Jackson Powers Johnson. We've talked about as a first-round candidate for the Seahawks. But I have some reservations about, is he going to be able to consistently make those downfield throws and even the 15 to 20-yard intermediate throws at the next level? Because a lot of the big gains that he had in the passing game were on quick dump-offs where his athletes were able to pick up big chunks of yardage. And this is the thing that jumps out to me. Pro Football Focus had him down for 20 big-time throws, which was just barely inside the top 30 quarterbacks in the country, while guys like Michael Penix Jr. were up in the top 5. And yet he had one of the highest yards per attempt. A big reason for that is that number was skewed by a lot of the big yards after the catch completions that he had in that Ducks offense. Again, I think his quick release contributed some to that as well, and that is a positive trait of his. But day 2, it would make some sense if the Seahawks had not traded for Sam Howell. I see this being a case where there's a lot of repetition between those two players, and I think Sam Howell has more upside as a downfield passer than what Bo Nix does. So we'll see what happens. But another big name that has been reported, and this is the one that I'm quite frankly more excited about, not just because of needs, but just the player himself, and that is Chop Robinson coming from Penn State. The numbers don't look gaudy by any means. Only 4.5 sacks, 7.5 tackles for loss. He did force 2 fumbles last season, but you look at what he did at the combine, and I see this on tape from him. Going back and watching film, before I started watching film on this kid, I had reservations because when you look at numbers, it can paint one picture. The film can paint another. I was worried it was going to show, well, this is why the numbers were so low. But Chop Robinson had a very high pass rush win rate last year, and you see that on the film. The sacks might not have been there, but he was extremely disruptive, and that's why he was a first-team All-Big Ten selection. They weren't looking at just numbers. Teams that played against this guy realized just how much of a disruptive presence he was, and it feels like there's still so much left for him to do. And, oh, by the way, he ran a blazing fast time, 4.48 in the 40-yard dash at 250-plus pounds. There's so much upside here. Potential is a dangerous word, and yet I see enough on film to suggest to me that this guy is not a huge risk to take a chance on late first round if you're the Seattle Seahawks.
I think even mid first round, Chop Robinson has a chance here, just because Corbin, his unique skill set translates so incredibly well to the NFL. At least in my opinion, I think Chop Robinson has the best first step of any pass rusher in this draft class. I mean, bar none. Not Leatu Latu, my personal top-rated edge rusher who, was the defensive lineman of the year, defensive end of the year, the Morris Trophy Award winner. Not Dallas Turner from Alabama, who I expect to be the first defensive player drafted this year. It's Chop Robinson. And again, for those of you watching on YouTube, you can see he had 4.5 sacks this past season. Now, that's one of the questions I have about him is just durability. And he missed a couple of games due to a concussion. He is not quite as physical at the point of attack as that flashy nickname Chop would suggest. But again, his upfield burst, Corbin, is absolutely dynamic. I think this guy could come into the NFL and perhaps contend for double-digit sacks as a rookie. I don't think that he is the most well-rounded player in this draft class, however, and that's why I have some reservations about possibly using a first-round selection on a guy that's essentially a specialist. But if we go back in time, you might remember when Seahawks with John Schneider and, of course, then Pete Carroll made a selection of a Bruce Irvin, and I think that that's the same type of elite speed off of the edge that Chop Robinson provides, and that's one of the reasons why the Seahawks just want to do their due diligence to make sure that they know this young man, because he would be among the few defensive players in this draft class, Corbin, that I think would justify making a selection of a defensive player rather than going with a pretty low-hanging fruit here that I think it is selecting an offensive lineman in the first round.
I love the Bruce Irvin comp for another reason, and you mentioned not a well-rounded player. The stat line suggests that, but then when I was turning on Penn State's tape, not a lot of opportunities to defend the run, but Chop Robinson did have 7.5 tackles for loss, and his average depth of tackle, according to PFF last year, was -1. That means this guy was living in the backfield defending the run. Did he get blown up sometimes? Yes, but there's still room for this guy to grow into his body. And I saw a 1-2 against the run, which we have not seen from Darrell Taylor. So I see that in Bruce Irvin's tape going back in the day. There were questions about that, but when you turn on the tape, you're like, I see the 1-2 to be a run defender. I see that from Chop Robinson too. So I didn't see that from Darrell Taylor. He fell into the second round. I don't see that happening with Chop Robinson because he's an even more explosive athlete. He's not coming into the league off a broken leg either. So I think that this is a guy the Seahawks are very much interested in. They are confident in the group they have, but if you can upgrade there late in the first after trading down, or even at 16, Chop Robinson is a guy that has the traits and tangibles coming from a Power 5 school. And we know those are all things that John Schneider has on his checklist when he's looking at top draft picks. Coming up next, it's Mock Draft Monday. We are going to swing to an NFL.com 5-round mock draft and investigate the picks made by Chad Ryder, well-respected Chad Ryder of NFL.com. We'll get to that here in a moment here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by GameTime. You shouldn't have to worry or start ripping your hair out when you buy tickets to your next big event. GameTime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and with their best price guarantee, GameTime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Do you want to see the national title game in Phoenix on Monday night? Thanks to GameTime's awesome flash deals feature and a detailed stadium map, you can actually get seats to the national title game for under $250 right now. And it's super easy. Forget planning months in advance. GameTime has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and GameTime's guarantee means you'll always get the best price. So if you find tickets in the same section and row for less elsewhere, GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in. And thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are running out of mock draft Mondays here on Locked On Seahawks. It might be hard to believe, but we've really got 3 of these left, including today. We've got next week and then draft week. Rob, you and I are going to dish out our final mock drafts, and then we're going to be at the draft later that week. So it is coming very quickly. With that said, we're going to take a look today at a 5-round mock draft by Chad Ryder of NFL.com. We've looked at his mock draft several times on the show. Does a great job for NFL.com. Let's break down these picks, and there's also 2 trades that we're going to need to discuss as well. And so looking at this mock draft from Chad Ryder, Rob, round 1, pick 22, which is originally held by the Philadelphia Eagles. In this mock, Seattle trades down with Philadelphia, and that is one of the teams I've identified that I think there's a really good chance the Eagles will try to move up into the middle of the first round. So the Seahawks would be dropping from 16 to 22. And in this trade, they would also get pick 50 while giving up pick 102. So they give up one of their 4th rounders, but they get a 2nd round pick at 50 overall. And they also have the 22nd pick in the first, which they use on Jerzon Newton, also known as Johnny Newton, a player you and I both are big fans of. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about him later in the show. But when you're just looking at the tape, it's easy to see why this guy would jump out to the Seahawks, even with the investments they've already made on that defensive line.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, this is a 3-time all Big Ten player. This is a guy who has positional versatility. He can, line up basically all over the interior. He doesn't have elite height. He's only 6'2", doesn't have elite arm length or straight line speed. But Corbin, he is just the most disruptive interior defensive lineman in this draft class. I mean, he is a proven playmaker. He led the country in block kicks this past season. I mean, and that was one of the knocks on him. People thought, okay, well, Illinois loses an elite safety, or at least a safety that was drafted high in the NFL. And of course, Devin Witherspoon, number 5 overall selection, is a defensive line that played as well as Jerzon Newton and the Illini did over the last couple of seasons. Is that going to be able to hold up once they lose a couple of guys to the NFL? They were even better this past season. Trezon Newton, in my opinion, Corbin, should be among the candidates the Seahawks should consider at number 16 overall. If he is available in a trade down to number 22, then oh my goodness, I think you absolutely have to strongly make or consider this type of a selection, even though, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, it does leave you kind of hoping that there's going to be some talented offensive linemen still fall to you. But I thought that this was a quality start for Chad in terms of the mock draft, because I do think, as you said, that we think that this is a plausible scenario. The Seahawks trading with the Philadelphia Eagles, who are looking to move up, and Howie Roseman and John Schneider have a great deal of familiarity with each other. And again, I think that it makes some sense. This is a position of concern for the Seahawks. But once we start getting a little deeper into this draft, Corbin, I feel like that the value that Seattle got in the first round starts to dissipate all throughout the rest of day two.
Yeah, you and I are just honest with our assessments. And again, these are just assessments that we personally came up with. That doesn't mean that it's the messiah by any means. Chad may have more intel on some of these guys or a better understanding of where they fit with the Seahawks. But I feel like after this selection, the value standpoint, I do have some questions with. And Newton at number 22, to me, would be a home run pick if you get him at that spot, because I have him down as my number 10 player in this entire draft class right now. And I'm still working on getting all my film done. But this is the thing that I've said about him. He, to me, every single is waiting to decombust. The guy just is explosive. He might not be the fastest defensive tackle in this class, but my goodness, is he aggressive. He gets upfield, and the relentless motor. I can't tell you how many tackles this guy made coming from the opposite side of the line this year for Illinois, chasing guys down. So that made his average depth of tackle very misleading. He was near the bottom of the entire college football rankings for defensive tackles, but you watch film, you're like, well, these 4 plays probably weighed it way down, because he is very disruptive and makes a lot of tackles. But when I look at the next couple picks, Seattle gets that second round pick at pick 50. Trevin Wallace, I've got as an early day 3 player in my rankings. And I know that a lot of draft analysts have him much higher. I just don't see a guy that plays at 240 plus pounds. That's what he weighed in. He had a really solid combine, but I don't see a player that plays to that size. Now, do I see some flashy plays where he gets his hands in the football for picks and he's able to get into the backfield and sack quarterbacks, hit running backs? Absolutely. There's some disruptive tendencies, but I also see a guy that for his size had some issues getting off blocks in the SEC. So I have some reservations about him this early. If you could get him at pick 81 or in the 4th round, I'd feel better about this. But there's some other linebackers that I expect are going to be available here that, quite frankly, I think are going to be more pro ready and offer a more balanced game. That's just my opinion.
No, I 100% agree with you. And look, and I have a great deal of respect for Chad Ryder's analysis. We just disagree on this particular player. At least Chad and I disagree. And Corbin, you and I 100% agree with the evaluation of Trevor Wallace and where he is likely to come off the board. I have him in the 4th to 5th round. There's no doubt about that. He was a very productive player for Kentucky, at least this past season. He had 80 tackles, 8.5 for loss, 5.5 sacks. He had 3 interceptions over his career at Kentucky. So obviously he can play a little bit of ball and coverage. And then he goes to the combine. And he's spectacular there. 4.52 in the 40-yard dash, 37.5-inch vertical jump, 10.7 broad. Those are all top 3 numbers among linebackers in this class.
You don't see it on film, though, Rob.
Exactly. And that's the thing, is that I see a guy that has a great deal of kind of combine numbers, but not a lot of quality football plays. And so that's where it concerns me. Number 50 overall feels a little bit rich. I like the idea of an inside linebacker. To me, that's part of the argument of why Seattle might make a trade of this nature. A Junior Colson might just be waiting for you at this point. So to me, that is a guy that makes a little bit more sense in terms of his size, his physicality, and a guy who, frankly, the combine results or pro day results of Junior Colson has translates a little bit more to the football field than I believe that Trevor Wallace's does.
Going to Seattle's first native pick on this mock draft. And again, you and I have great respect for Chad Ryder. I cannot stand this pick personally. Now, you may be more on the side that you like this one, but Layden Robinson, the guard from Texas A&M. I have him as the 14th ranked guard on my rankings, and I have him as a 5th round pick right now. And I know he played in the SEC. He's a big human being. He can move people. I just have real reservations about him as an athlete. And quite frankly, his pass pro tape, his numbers aren't that bad, but this is a case where the numbers, I look at the tape and I'm wondering, how is this guy going to be able to consistently protect Geno Smith or whoever his quarterback is behind him with the struggles he had with college defenders attacking his edges? How is he going to be able to do that in the NFL level? This is one of those guys in a program that underachieved, that quite frankly, I felt underachieved for his talent level. I just have reservations about picking him on day 2, to be honest.
No, I do as well. And so rather than kind of focus too much on trade, I'm going to kind of just focus on the positional group. I do like, again, the idea of possibly going with a defensive lineman or a defensive player in general in the first round, dropping back down, going with the inside linebacker in day 2, the pick that you selected, and then coming back in the 3rd round. To me, this is where if John Schneider and the Seahawks decide they are not going to go with an offensive lineman in the 1st round, this is the sweet spot. You got to make sure that you get a starting caliber player here, either in the 2nd round or in the 3rd round, because after that it's going to drop off a little bit. I personally view this player as a little bit more of a day 3 guy as well. But again, I understand the rationale for coming back and trying to get an SEC proven long arm, massive man for the interior. Obviously, that's a huge area of concern for the Seahawks.
Yeah, that would be the one positive argument that I would make here. This is an SEC tested player, and we know John Schneider loves Power 5 prospects. I just personally, I've watched a lot of Texas A&M film, in particular looking at their defense with McKinley Jackson, who I liked most of his film. I feel like this is a player, though, that really did struggle with inconsistency, much as the program has the last couple of years, and not really living up to standards. As far as the last pick made in this mock draft, Seattle did not have a 5th. They still don't have a 5th in this mock. But this is the one that you and I think that we are torn on. And Jalix Hunt, the edge from Houston Christian, he did participate in the combine, put up really impressive numbers for a 250-plus pound defensive end edge rusher. He was a safety when he first went to Houston Christian too. So you knew the athleticism was going to be there. The traits are there. I don't see a player, though, that is going to be able to play on defense for you for at least a year. It might take him 2 years before he's ready to play against NFL competition. I also don't see a guy, quite frankly, that has the physicality right now to be able to play against the run. So I see at best him being a situational rusher with the athleticism. You see it when he gets upfield, but this is a guy that I would think the sweet spot is the 5th or 6th round. 4th feels way too rich. I know John Schneider likes the traits, but also he doesn't like picking small school guys. I just can't see him doing it in the 4th round either.
No, I have to agree with you. That has definitely been different than Seattle's MO in the past. I am intrigued by Hunt's burst and the length. He has some explosiveness to him, but he is sushi raw. I 100% agree with you that this is absolutely a project. This is basically saying, all right, Mike McDonald, you are the defensive guru. Let's see you coach up a player that has some traits to him, but he isn't going to be competing for any type of real playing time, at least early in his career, which maybe that's the idea. Maybe Seattle is going to be looking for a developmental middle round edge rusher, because the edge rusher, if you're going to go for an edge rusher, we had this conversation previously with Chop Robinson, then you basically have to either, if you're looking for a guy who's going to be able to make an immediate impact, he's probably going to have to be at number 16 overall or in a possible trade down. And, and I don't think you can go too far down in this particular class. So again, I understand the rationale behind the selection. I think it's a little bit rich at this point, but I do think that Hunt would be one of the few edge rushers in the middle rounds that does have the upside to him to at least warrant a little bit of a mid-round gamble at this point.
When we come back for our final segment here on our Monday episode, the Seahawks, most fans expect, are going to be drafting an offensive lineman, an interior offensive lineman early, but There are other positions that John Schneider could look to draft a blue chip talent, especially if a player falls to them after a trade down. We're going to look at 3 specific scenarios, including a player that Chad Ryder just drafted in his mock draft, and what the ripple effects could be for the Seahawks in later rounds. We'll dive to a little bit of what if coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a bit more time for painting and creating artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make sure it's a priority. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs. It can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designated to be convenient. It's flexible. It's suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime at no additional charge. Learn to make more time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and tired of having to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make sure to switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. It's streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're less than 3 weeks away from the 2024 NFL Draft. The Seahawks slated to pick first at number 16 overall. They do not have a second-round selection. That has led to a lot of speculation. They're going to be trying to move down to recoup another day 2 pick, at least another day 2 selection. John Schneider's not been a stranger to trading down multiple times in the first round in the past. It's happened a few times. Keeping that in mind, everybody's anticipating that the Seahawks are going to draft an offensive lineman, though history paints a different picture. John Schneider, if it's not a tackle, has not drafted earlier than the second round for a center or a guard. Ethan Poslick was a second-round pick. He's never picked a guard earlier than the third round. James Carpenter was originally drafted as a tackle before injuries eventually moved him inside, but they drafted him as a tackle. So this is not a position group, Rob, that John Schneider has drafted high at any point in his time with the Seahawks since 2010. Keeping that in mind, we got to look at those wild card candidates at other positions that might not necessarily be viewed as the biggest areas of need, but in terms of best player available, could make a lot of sense. And I know you are chomping at the bit to talk about a certain defensive tackle that we already touched on today, but Jerzon Newton is a player that just screams Seahawks, and yet at the same time, he also screams Mike McDonald with his ability to move up and down the line and just his pure disruptiveness.
Yeah, no question about it. And as we talked about earlier, Corbin, I mean, he would rank him the best player available on either of our boards if he was available to the Seahawks at number 16 overall. He was the player that I projected Seahawks to take in the very first mock draft that I did for Fox Sports, which, by the way, so just turn the volume down. Sometimes we're okay. But anyways, Jerzon Newton make a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons why I think that we should do this little exercise here, as far as if Seattle was going to go with a defensive player in the first round, then, oh my goodness, what does that mean as far as which offensive lineman might be available? If you have to wait all the way to number 81 overall, as we talked about before, the difference between number 16, where Seattle currently has their top pick, and number 81 overall, that 65 selection gap is the biggest in all of the NFL. And so if you're going to get cute, if you're going to take a defensive tackle like a Jerzon Newton, who's an unbelievable player, or any of these other defensive players that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment, make sure you understand that the talent drop-off is huge among the offensive linemen here. So I'm going to go with, if the Seahawks were going to take Jerzon Newton here, if they wanted to focus up the spine, as Mike McDonald mentioned a couple of, I guess it's been a couple of weeks ago now in an interview, then I'm going to go back with an offensive lineman as somebody maybe that Seattle might be trying to target here in the middle rounds. And that being a player, actually a teammate of Jerzon Newton's as well as Devin Witherspoon's, and that being kind of the rationale here. Isaiah Adams, and he was a player that played at the right tackle position most of this past season, but I like him best at guard. He's got the size, the length, the physicality, everything you're looking for, but still he is going to be a bit of an adjustment from going from right tackle back to the left guard position, where I think that he could compete for a starting role. So I love the idea of a Jerzon Newton, but just make sure that you have some idea of the drop-off you're going to be seeing as far as offensive line. I think there's Pro Bowlers aplenty potentially available to Seattle at number 16 overall if they want to go on the offensive side of the ball. If they don't, however, again, I think that at that point you're searching for somebody who might be able to compete for a starting job at left guard, but not necessarily a guarantee at that point in the draft.
And I could sit here in all these scenarios and I could list off a guard for a mid-round priority pick. I could do it on every single one of these. But you and I both know, Rob, the Seahawks have other areas beyond 2024 that there may be some question marks about. And for me, one of them is the safety position. If they go with a defensive tackle in Jerzon Newton in the first round, particularly if they trade down, you do get an extra pick on day 2, hopefully sliding down. It gives you one more shot to add a guard, but it also gives you a chance to add another playmaker in your secondary. Julian Love's a free agent next year. Kayvon Wallace is a free agent next year. Rayshon Jenkins has a 2-year deal, but easy outs for next season if Seattle wants to move on from him too. There's not a long-term starter under contract right now at that position. And Dadrian Taylor Demerson from Texas Tech, we've talked about him a lot on here. He isn't just an athlete. Obviously had the fastest 40 time of any safety in Indianapolis, but he has got great ball skills. There have been limited opportunities for him to blitz, and yet he's been very effective last year. 6 blitzes, 6 pressures for Texas Tech, and he's a very sound tackler that can come plays, run game. I just look at him being a Mike McDonald style safety that can play both those positions and also play some in the nickel as well. If you can get him in those middle rounds, maybe one of those day 2 selections, then I think that this really has a chance to solidify your defense. You'd have Witherspoon, you'd have Newton, you'd have Woolen, and now you add Taylor Demerson to the mix. You've got some really intriguing young chess pieces that you can move all over the place, which is exactly what Mike McDonald's looking for. Speaking of chess pieces, let's go to the other scenario on defense here. That this is the one that I've been clamoring for just because the film suggests to me that this is a Mike McDonald style player, and I just think he's a really, really good football player. But Cooper DeJean, who I have heard broadcasters call him DeJean, so people that have calling me out, I was told by somebody close to Iowa's program it is DeJean, but I have heard DeJean on a bunch of broadcasts. So we're going to say DeJean because that sounds like that's what it's supposed to be. But Cooper DeJean had 3 interceptions, return of touchdowns 2 years ago. Last year, an injury shortened his season, but he still had 2 picks. Really sound tackler, returned a punt for a touchdown. This is that best player available that I think John Schneider and Mike McDonald can have some really tough times passing up on, especially if they trade down and he is still available. But you want to talk about something that would have ripple effects later in the draft, Rob. If you don't take a guard there or a defensive lineman, you avoid the trenches in general, and you pick another secondary player after drafting Devin Witherspoon last year, there will be some that wonder, is this getting a little bit too rich in a position you already have some really good players and avoiding areas that you're deficient?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest argument against taking a player like Cooper DeJean, because he is just a terrific football player. In my opinion, he's the most instinctive defensive player in this draft class. You mentioned the fact that he had a couple of different interceptions returned for touchdowns. I mean, you consider the 3 that he had as a defensive player, the 1 as a punt return. That means he scored 4 touchdowns. Corbin, according to PFF, he only gave up 2 touchdowns in 3 seasons as a starter at Iowa. And I just love the positional versatility. I think that he is a guy that that matches very favorably to an all-pro with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Minkah Fitzpatrick. And that type of a player is exactly the kind of a guy that might force the Seahawks to kind of go away from the offensive line focus in the first round. So yes, Cooper DeJean would make an awful lot of sense. If the Seahawks were going to go that route at number 16 overall, or in a small trade down, you couldn't trade down too far and still be able to get that. I don't care what other people are writing and saying out there. If you do go that route, though, again, just kind of like we talked about before, clearly you can just project an offensive lineman for every selection here. If you're going to go kind of against the grain here with the safety and Cooper DeJean and a punt returner, a dynamic one at that, then I think that you might want to go against the grain again here in the third round. One of the tight ends that really makes an awful lot of sense to me would be from Ohio State. And I'm spacing on his name.
Cade Stover.
And Cade Stover, and this is the former defensive player that it reminds me a little bit of Sam Laporta, who was drafted out of Iowa, interestingly enough, a year ago by the Detroit Lions, and he is just more physical, more athletic than the hype out there would suggest. He is going to be a top 100 selection that I view as a future starter. You talked about the lack of depth that Seattle has at the safety position. Same thing at tight end as well. And so, to me, if you're going to go with kind of out of left field kind of a selection, it's going to have the analysts on TV scratching their collective heads. Then Cooper DeJean in the first round, come back with Cade Stover in the third round, and there's going to be a lot of people wondering, where's the beef in Seattle?
See, this is the scenario. At least you're getting beef with Jerzon Newton. You're just getting onto the defensive line. If the Seahawks were to go this route, and I would be just ecstatic if they made this selection from a football analyst standpoint. Because again, I've talked about the player we're discussing here. 3 missed tackles the entire 2022 season, Rob. Very few opportunities to play in the box, but when he did, he made tackles for loss. I mean, the guy's just a football player. And we know John Schneider gets really excited about football players rather than just looking at positions. But if you're going to take another secondary guy in this round, in the first round, you've got to get some beef. So Christian Mahogany, we've talked about quite a bit on here. I like the athleticism, the ability to get to the second level. There's been some injuries in his history, but I think at pick 81, that would be a sweet spot for a player like him. And as you talked about, I think if you don't get your guard there, it's going to get pretty thin after the third round. There's still going to be some decent players on day 3, but if you're looking for immediate starters, that well is going to dry up quickly because a ton of them are going to go on day 2. 81 might be your last chance to get one of those guys. Last player we're going to talk about here, Cooper DeJean is he's my guy, so to speak. I've been talking about him since February as a potential Seahawks target that jumped out to me on film. And I know that there's an off-ball linebacker. We talked Trevin Wallace earlier, that you and I are not quite as high on him as some people, but there's one player from Texas A&M that you are very high on that might go against the grain with some other draft experts that you think could be a fit for the Seahawks, even in the late first round.
Yeah, Edgerrin Cooper. To me, he is the one linebacker that makes some sense as a first-round candidate in this draft. He's 6'2", 230 pounds, Corbin, and he is equally dynamic as a pass rusher as well as dropping into coverage. He's got 34-inch arms, and I just think this is a young man whose best football still lies ahead of him. I'm looking for quickness. I'm looking for explosiveness, and Edgerrin Cooper definitely has both of those things. We know the Seahawks have brought in the 2 linebackers in free agency, but they're both on 1-year deals. And so there is not a position other than left guard that currently lacks more depth than inside linebacker. So Edgerrin Cooper would make some sense at 16 even, or certainly in a trade down scenario. I think that one linebacker that we haven't talked about enough that would make some sense in the middle rounds is Eddie Ulofoshio from Washington. I mean, he's a guy that is an absolutely spectacular athlete, has had some durability issues. That's why he might be available in the middle rounds. But at the same time, in terms of explosiveness, Edgerrin Cooper in the first round and all of the production that he has shown, and then Eddie Ulofoshio in the middle rounds, and all of the untapped potential that I still believe that the Anchorage, Alaska native possesses, would make some sense for the Seahawks as well.
Yeah, I look at Cooper's game. I've got him as a top 50 player. I'm not sure about first round because I have seen inconsistency from him in coverage, and I have some concerns. I watched the guy run around at the combine. He's just really lean. He's tall and lean. I wonder how he's going to hold up physically in the NFL. That is a question mark for me. But you cannot question the athleticism. And Mike McDonald, he talked about it at the league meetings. everybody on his defense has got to be an adept blitzer. This guy had 8 sacks last year for the Aggies. He also had 17 and a half tackles for loss. So he doesn't just create havoc as a pass rusher. He gets into the backfield a lot. He is a highly disruptive player. And you look at the way that he tested, the way that he runs, he's got the physical tools to be a good coverage linebacker. Mike McDonald might be the X factor here. If he can coach him up, if he and his staff can coach him up in coverage to go with the other traits he has, put another 5 pounds or so on him, this is a guy that could be a all-pro caliber player. So if you see him with that kind of ceiling, you trade down 24-25, Packers at 25, maybe you're saying Edgerrin Cooper fits the bill. This is a guy that we can bring in that could compete for starting snaps right away. But if he doesn't start right away, it's okay. We've got Jerome Baker. We've got Tyrell Dodson. We can sprinkle him in sub packages. We can use him as a blitzer some, and then eventually start. So I could see the merit there. And this is interesting. If they're going to go with a player like this, and on day 3, as far as mid-round targets, I would want to upgrade my slot position and maybe find a way to get Devin Witherspoon on the outside most of the time with Reek Woolen. I don't know if Kobe Bryant's that guy, but I'll tell you one guy that Mike McDonald loves, and that's Mike Sainristil from Michigan, who actually was still a receiver the year that Mike McDonald was coaching there, but he knows who he is. They had a meeting with him at the Combine, 6 interceptions last year for the national champion Wolverines. He's got great ball skills. I think he could play safety. I think he could play slot corner. He can obviously play outside corner, another one of those versatile weapons. If you have some concerns early about the coverage ability of your new off-ball linebacker, build around him and take away some of those responsibilities with guys who can handle those. And Sainristil is a guy that absolutely could do that. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we return on Tuesday, it's all about the centers. Where's the beef? We'll be talking about the beef when we come back on Tuesday. The center position, if the Seahawks have reservations about Olu Oluwatimi, could they look for a center? We'll be breaking down some of the top center prospects for this year's draft class. Make sure that you're listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.